So whether it's something we'd like to embrace or run far away from, there is no way we can deny that we live in a technologically advanced era. And what does this mean for our babies? There are lots of mixed messages. How much technology is too much? Don't we want our babies to be technologically savvy? Should we really encourage that? Are our babies overstimulated by this constant bombardment in social media, television, video games? Or are we maybe not giving our children enough compared to other babies? There is no straightforward answer. We can only go by what we know works for babies, and that takes us back to biology and the science of early development. Babies learn through sensory exploration, and that means that various angles of their brain development is dependent on how they touch, how they see, how they smell, how they feel. And if you asked yourself a very simple question, if you had an iPad in front of you, or a computer screen, or a smartphone, very often it is a one or maybe two-dimensional interaction, if an interaction at all. It allows very little opportunity for that baby to explore with their fine or gross motor adaptabilities. It also allows a baby to be more reliant on just a one-way stimulus, rather than being able to ask, to prop, to explore further. So if we went back to those basics, what would be good, or rather what should be good for a developing brain? A baby needs to crawl, a baby needs to discover. How we discover is by exploring, by encouraging curiosity. Babies put things in their mouth, babies touch, feel, smell, they hear voices, they develop language, they're able to taste, and they're able to develop more acutely their gustatory senses. Babies are able to touch something hot and not touch it again because they learn by mimicry and they learn by experience. And if we keep that in mind in terms of what is developmentally expected and appropriate for a developing infant brain, then it makes sense that we need to really limit those opportunities in the environment that limit our child's opportunities to grow and develop those sensory centers. A good example would be a child who is able to watch and perform quite complex tasks with a joystick or with an interactive iPad, but isn't able to complete a form board or a 100-piece puzzle. We often see that babies are quite advanced in terms of being able to track their eyes consistently at a moving target. But how this actually shows up later in childhood is contrary to the belief that your child is super brilliant in terms of technology. They aren't able to focus, they aren't able to sustain their attention, and they aren't able to apply executive functioning, which is the ability to think, to plan, and to complete an activity. We also aren't preparing our children for the real world. Very few play schools, creches, or middle grade schools offer children the opportunity to do all of their interactive learning on a computer or an iPad. Children are still required to write. They're still required to be able to complete certain form boards. They're able to complete and advance in terms of technology, but there are very few children who are able to complete and advance in terms of reading abilities, in terms of communication and language. So children learn by exploring, children learn by curiosity, and children learn by those age-appropriate experiences that are created for them. A good example, this always makes me think back to when we heard a story from a visiting professor at an infant mental health institute in Finland who said she was on a train one day and sitting across a mum and a 2-year-old or 2.5-year-old child who was busy on an iPad making no eye contact to the other person, and the iPad died. And so the mum takes the cartoon on the newspaper and gives it to the little child to look at the cartoon characters. And the professor notices that the child looks and then gets bored. And then instead of bringing the picture closer to her or moving herself closer, she stands and does this, almost expecting that newspaper to miraculously enlarge. And that's a really frightening thing to think of. If we are creating children who are so dependent on technology that they aren't able to practically problem solve. And why do we want them to problem solve if you can just type something into a computer and get an answer? Because life requires you to problem solve, to be able to self-regulate. When bad things happen, when accidents happen, when things don't go according to plan, we expect that children are able to think on their feet, that they're able to practically think of a solution and carry that by. But if we don't provide them with these appropriate learning experiences very early on, so in other words, if technology steals that away, then we're basically limiting the development that the infant brain is entitled to in terms of sensory stimulation. So how much TV time, how much technology, how much of video games is enough? I would say just enough. Just enough to not override the opportunity to allow your child to still be exposed to mainstream ideas of education. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but being able to encourage children to think, to be bored, to read, to form a puzzle on the floor, to be able to engage in a peer relationship is far more important than a child being technologically advanced.